Sarah Martinez counted her last $300, unaware that purchasing the abandoned Riverside Farm would lead her to discover a secret that would transform not only her struggling family's future, but reveal the extraordinary legacy of the farm's previous owner, a reclusive millionaire who had been quietly changing lives for decades. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Sarah Martinez stared at the eviction notice taped to her apartment door, her hands trembling as she clutched the crumpled bills in her pocket. $317. That was all that remained of her life savings after losing her job at Murphy's Diner 3 weeks ago. 8-year-old Emma peered around her mother's waist, her wide brown eyes reflecting the fear that Sarah tried desperately to hide, while 6-year-old Jake clung to his worn teddy bear, sensing the tension that had filled their small apartment for days. The landlord had been patient, but patience had limits, and Sarah's had run out along with her options. She had applied to every job within walking distance, but without a car and with 2 children to care for, opportunities were as scarce as the money in her wallet. That evening, as rain pelted their windows and Sarah tucked her children into bed with promises she wasn't sure she could keep, she found herself scrolling through property listings on her cracked phone screen, desperate for any miracle that might save them from homelessness. That's when she saw it. Riverside Farm, 150 acres with a farmhouse, listed for exactly $300. The price was so impossibly low that Sarah initially thought it was a mistake, but the listing had been active for months. She read the description with growing hope and growing dread. The property had been abandoned for over a year. The previous owner had died with no heirs, and local rumors claimed the land was cursed. Neighbors whispered about strange occurrences, unexplained lights, and the reclusive man who had lived there alone for decades, speaking to no one and welcoming no visitors. The real estate agent's note was blunt. Property sold as is. Buyer assumes all risks. Local community advises against purchase. But Sarah saw something different in those warnings. She saw a chance, perhaps their only chance, to have a roof over their heads and space for her children to grow. The farmhouse might be run down, the land might be overgrown, and the neighbors might whisper about curses, but it would be theirs. That night, she made a decision that would change everything. With her last $300, Sarah Martinez bought Riverside Farm, unaware that she was about to discover the most extraordinary secret hidden in its depths, a secret that would reveal the true nature of the man everyone called a hermit, and transform not only her family's desperate circumstances, but touch the lives of an entire community in ways she could never imagine. The rusted gate of Riverside Farm creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo across the empty fields, and Sarah's heart sank as she took in the sight before them. The farmhouse stood like a forgotten memory against the gray morning sky, its white paint peeling in long strips, shutters hanging at odd angles, and a front porch that sagged under the weight of neglect. Emma's small hand slipped into hers, squeezing tight as they walked up the overgrown path where weeds pushed through cracked stones and wild roses had claimed the fence posts. Jake pressed close to Sarah's other side, his teddy bear clutched against his chest as his wide eyes took in their new home. The key turned easily in the front door lock, as if it had been waiting for them, and they stepped inside to find rooms filled with dust motes dancing in the pale sunlight that filtered through grimy windows. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, and Sarah noticed water stains on the ceiling where rain had found its way through missing shingles. But she forced brightness into her voice as she turned to her children. "Look at all this space you'll have to play," she said, gesturing toward the large living room with its stone fireplace and built-in bookshelves. "And Emma, that window seat will be perfect for reading." They explored room by room, finding a kitchen with an old cast-iron stove that might still work, bedrooms with hardwood floors that could be beautiful once cleaned, and a bathroom that needed attention but had good bones. Outside, the property stretched farther than they could see, with apple trees heavy with fruit that had gone unharvested, fields that had once been farmland now returning to wildness, and a red barn that leaned slightly but still stood proud against the horizon. It was while exploring the house that they discovered the basement door, heavy oak painted black, secured with an old iron lock that looked far newer than anything else in the house. Jake backed away immediately, hiding behind Sarah's legs, while Emma stared at it with the fascination that only children possess for mysteries. "What's down there, Mama?" Emma asked, reaching toward the door handle. "I don't know, sweetheart," Sarah replied, gently pulling her daughter's hand back. "But we don't need to worry about it right now. We have plenty to explore up here." As evening approached and they shared a simple dinner of sandwiches by candlelight, since the electricity had been shut off months ago, Sarah watched her children's faces in the flickering glow and felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. This place might be broken, might need more work than she knew how to give it. But it was theirs. And sometimes a fresh start begins with nothing more than four walls, and the courage to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. The first night at Riverside Farm tested every ounce of courage Sarah thought she possessed. As darkness fell like a heavy blanket over the isolated property, and the old house began to reveal its secrets, they had spread their sleeping bags in what once must have been the master bedroom. Huddled together on the dusty hardwood floor, while candles flickered from mason jars they'd found in the kitchen, casting dancing shadows on the water-stained walls, the September rain that had threatened all day finally began in earnest, drumming against the windows before finding its way through loose shingles and missing flashing, creating a symphony of drips into the pots and bowls Sarah had strategically placed around the room. Jake whimpered softly every time thunder rolled across the valley, and Emma pressed closer to her mother's side when the old house creaked and settled around them, its wooden bones adjusting to the changing weather. But it was the sounds from below that truly unnerved them all. A rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the floorboards, followed by what sounded almost like footsteps, though Sarah told herself it was just the house settling or perhaps mice in the walls. "Mama, I'm scared," Jake whispered, his teddy bear damp with tears. What if the people were right about this place being cursed? Sarah wrapped her arms around both children, her own doubts echoing their fears, as she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake with their last precious dollars. "Houses make sounds when they're old, sweetheart," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's just the rain and the wind, nothing more." In the morning light that streamed through the grimy windows, the fears of the night seemed almost silly. But Sarah's doubts remained as she surveyed the enormity of the task ahead of them. While the children explored the yard, she began opening drawers and cabinets in the kitchen, looking for anything that might tell her more about the previous owner, the mysterious Henry Blackwood whom the neighbors had described as a recluse. In the bottom drawer of an old hutch, beneath yellowed newspapers and faded receipts, she found a photograph that made her pause. The image showed a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing beside a garden that was clearly this same property but transformed, lush and well-tended, with the farmhouse painted white and welcoming behind him. On the back, someone had written in careful script, "Henry Blackwood, Riverside Farm, 1998. This was not the face of a hermit or a man to be feared, Sarah thought as she studied the photograph. This was the face of someone who had loved this place, who had cared for it. And as she looked from the picture to the neglected rooms around her, she felt the first stirring of determination to restore not just their home, but the memory of the man who had called it home before them. The knock on the front door came just as Sarah was attempting to coax life from the old water pump behind the kitchen, and she wiped her muddy hands on her jeans before opening it to find 3 people standing on her sagging porch, with expressions that ranged from curious to deeply concerned. The woman in front appeared to be in her 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Sarah's appearance and the disheveled state of the house behind her. "I'm Margaret Henderson," the woman said without preamble, gesturing toward the neighboring property visible through the overgrown hedgerow. "This is Tom Bradley from down the road, and Janet Mills from the post office. We heard someone had actually bought this place." The skepticism in her voice made it clear that she considered this decision somewhere between foolish and dangerous. Sarah invited them in, though the house hardly seemed welcoming with its peeling wallpaper and musty smell, and the four adults stood awkwardly in the living room while Emma and Jake peered around the corner with the wide-eyed curiosity of children sensing adult drama. "You seem like a nice enough woman," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "But I'm afraid you've made a terrible mistake buying this property. Henry Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with. And this place carries his darkness still." Tom Bradley nodded grimly, his weathered farmer's hands clasped behind his back as he spoke. "Lived here nearly 20 years myself, and in all that time, Henry never spoke a word to any of us. Wouldn't return a greeting, wouldn't accept help when his fence was down or his roof was leaking. Just watched us from his windows like we were trespassers on his land." Janet Mills, a thin woman with nervous energy, added her own observations in a voice barely above a whisper. "Strange lights in the windows at all hours, deliveries coming and going at odd times. And that basement of his, always locked up tight. When he died last winter, they say it took 3 days before anyone even noticed, and the coroner couldn't explain some of the things they found." Henderson stepped closer to Sarah, her expression softening slightly but losing none of its intensity. "There are things better left buried on this property, dear. Secrets that died with Henry Blackwood, and they should stay dead. This land has a weight to it, a heaviness that settles in your bones if you stay too long. I've lived next door for 15 years, and I'm telling you as a neighbor and a Christian woman, you should take whatever money you have left and find somewhere else for you and those children." As the three neighbors filed out, leaving Sarah standing in her doorway with their warnings echoing in the empty rooms behind her, she caught Mrs. Henderson's arm gently. "What exactly are you afraid I'll find?" she asked quietly. The older woman's eyes darted toward the basement door visible through the kitchen doorway, then back to Sarah's face. "Some stones are better left unturned, child. Some secrets take more than they give." 3 days after the neighbor's ominous visit, Sarah was scrubbing the kitchen cabinets with determination born of necessity when her fingertips brushed against something metallic taped to the underside of the top shelf, hidden where only someone specifically looking would ever find it. Her heart hammered as she worked the object free, and there in her palm lay an old brass key, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, attached to a small paper tag that read simply HB. In the same careful handwriting she'd seen on the photograph, the basement door seemed to loom larger as she approached it, the black paint somehow darker than it had appeared before, and she could hear Mrs. Henderson's warnings echoing in her mind about things better left buried and secrets that should stay dead. Emma and Jake were outside picking apples, their laughter floating through the open windows, and Sarah knew that whatever lay beyond this door would either confirm her neighbor's fears or put them to rest forever. The key slid into the lock as if it belonged there, turning with a soft click that seemed to echo through the quiet house. And as the heavy door swung open on well-oiled hinges, Sarah expected to find cobwebs and darkness, perhaps the source of those mysterious sounds that had frightened them their first night. Instead, a motion sensor light flickered on, revealing wooden stairs that descended into what appeared to be a finished basement, clean and organized in a way that contrasted sharply with the neglected condition of the house above. Her breath caught in her throat as she descended, each step revealing more of an extraordinary sight that defied every expectation the neighbors had planted in her mind. The basement had been transformed into what could only be described as an office, with metal filing cabinets lining one wall, a large desk positioned beneath fluorescent lights, and shelves upon shelves of carefully labeled binders and document boxes. The air smelled not of must and decay, but of paper and ink, the scent of a place where important work had been conducted. Sarah approached the nearest filing cabinet with trembling hands, pulling open the top drawer to reveal manila folders arranged in perfect alphabetical order, each one thick with papers and documents that appeared to be financial in nature. Bank statements, receipts, correspondence with lawyers and accountants, and what looked like donation records filled folder after folder, all bearing dates from recent years, and all meticulously organized by someone who clearly valued precision and detail. A large corkboard mounted on the far wall displayed maps of the county with colored pins marking various locations, and beside it hung a whiteboard covered in names, addresses, and dollar amounts written in that same careful handwriting she was beginning to recognize. This was not the lair of a reclusive hermit or the source of anything sinister. Sarah realized as she stood in the center of Henry Blackwood's secret sanctuary. This was the headquarters of someone who had been conducting business. Important business. With the kind of organization and attention to detail that spoke of a man with purpose and method, not madness. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the first folder labeled Anonymous Donations 2023 and found herself staring at a world that shattered every assumption she had made about Henry Blackwood, a world that revealed not the dark secrets of a reclusive hermit, but the extraordinary generosity of a man who had dedicated his life to helping others in silence. Page after page of meticulously documented transactions filled her vision. $10,000 to cover emergency surgery for Maria Santos, a single mother from the neighboring town. $5,000 for the Williams family's mortgage when the father lost his job at the factory. $1,500 for school supplies distributed anonymously through the local elementary school, and $3,000 to repair the roof of the senior center after the storm last spring. Each entry was accompanied by newspaper clippings, thank you letters addressed to anonymous donor, and detailed notes in Henry's careful handwriting about the recipients and their circumstances. Sarah sank into the desk chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was discovering, as she opened file after file revealing a pattern of giving that stretched back over 2 decades. College scholarships for deserving students who couldn't afford tuition, medical bills paid in full for families facing bankruptcy, rent payments made for elderly residents on fixed incomes, Christmas gifts delivered anonymously to children whose families had fallen on hard times. The scope was breathtaking, the attention to detail remarkable, and the amounts staggering as she found bank statements showing millions of dollars flowing through multiple accounts, all designated for charitable giving. One entire filing cabinet contained correspondence with lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors, all sworn to secrecy about their clients' philanthropic activities. Letters from beneficiaries filled another section. Heartfelt notes of gratitude addressed to someone they would never meet. Stories of lives changed and families saved from desperation by unexpected kindness. Henry had kept every thank you card, every child's drawing, every letter of appreciation, filing them carefully by date and family name as if each one were a precious treasure. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal, and Sarah opened it with reverence to find Henry's own words, written in his distinctive script. Today I learned that the Peterson family is facing foreclosure after their youngest was diagnosed with leukemia. The medical bills have consumed their savings, and they are too proud to ask for help. Tomorrow I will arrange for their mortgage to be paid in full through the usual channels. They will never know who helped them, and that is exactly as it should be. True generosity requires no recognition, no gratitude, no acknowledgement. The joy is in the giving itself, in the knowledge that somewhere in this world, a family sleeps peacefully tonight because a stranger chose to care. As Sarah closed the journal and looked around the basement office that had been Henry Blackwood's command center for compassion, she realized that the man her neighbors had feared and misunderstood had actually been their guardian angel, working tirelessly in secret to lift up everyone around him while asking for nothing in return. Sarah's world tilted on its axis when she opened the filing cabinet drawer labeled M through P and found a folder bearing her own name, written in Henry's careful script. Martinez, Sarah. Emma's birth emergency. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the manila folder, as memories came flooding back of that terrifying November night 8 years ago, when Emma had arrived 6 weeks early, weighing barely 4 pounds, and the doctors had rushed her tiny daughter to the neonatal intensive care unit, while Sarah lay helpless in her hospital bed, consumed with fear and the crushing weight of bills she knew she could never afford. Inside the folder lay photocopies of medical records, correspondence with St. Mary's Hospital administrators, and a canceled check for $47,812, dated 3 days after Emma's birth, and made out to cover every penny of their catastrophic medical expenses. A handwritten note clipped to the front of the file read, "Young mother. Alone. working double shifts at Murphy's Diner to support herself during pregnancy. Father abandoned them when he learned of the complications. Medical staff reports she has been crying over the bills, afraid to hold her own daughter because she cannot afford the care the child needs. Immediate intervention required. Sarah remembered that morning when the hospital financial counselor had called her into the office, expecting to discuss payment plans and medical debt that would have followed her for decades, only to be told that an anonymous benefactor had settled their account in full and that she was free to take Emma home when the doctors cleared her. She had cried tears of relief and gratitude, wondering who could have been so generous. What angel had been watching over them? And now, she knew. Henry Blackwood had been that angel. A man she had never met, who had somehow learned of their desperate situation and stepped in to save them, without ever seeking acknowledgement or thanks. Another document in the file showed that Henry had continued to watch over them from afar, noting when Sarah had been laid off from various jobs, when they had struggled with rent, when Emma had needed school supplies or Jake had required emergency dental work. He had prepared to help them again multiple times, but had held back when Sarah had managed to solve each crisis on her own, respecting her independence while remaining ready to intervene if she truly needed him. The final entry in the file was dated just 2 months before Henry's death. Sarah Martinez facing eviction, lost job at Murphy's Diner, down to last few $100s. Children are Emma age 8 and Jake age 6. Have been monitoring her situation closely. Property at Riverside Farm would be perfect for their family if presented as opportunity rather than charity. Estate planning with Thompson proceeding as discussed. Sarah clutched the folder to her chest as understanding washed over her like a wave, realizing that even Henry's death had been planned with her family's welfare in mind, that the impossibly low price of the farm, the convenient timing of the listing, everything had been orchestrated by a man who had already saved them once and was determined to save them again, even from beyond the grave. The black sedan appeared in the driveway like an apparition on a gray Thursday morning, its polished surface reflecting the autumn sky, as Sarah watched from the kitchen window, still clutching Henry's file on her family with trembling hands. The man who emerged wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carried a leather briefcase that spoke of expensive legal services, his silver hair combed with precision as he approached the farmhouse with the measured steps of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, her heart racing with the certainty that this visit was connected to the extraordinary discoveries she had made in Henry's basement, and the distinguished gentleman smiled warmly as he extended his hand in greeting. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm Theodore Thompson, attorney for the estate of Henry Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades handling delicate family matters. "I've been searching for you for quite some time." Sarah invited him inside, acutely aware of the house's shabby condition, as Mr. Thompson's practiced eyes took in the peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling, though his expression remained professionally neutral as they settled in the living room where Emma and Jake played quietly in the corner, stealing curious glances at their unexpected visitor. "I must confess, Mrs. Martinez, that finding you here at Riverside Farm is both a relief and a surprise," Mr. Thompson began, opening his briefcase with deliberate care. "Mr. Blackwood left very specific instructions regarding this property and your family. Instructions that I've been attempting to execute since his death 6 months ago." Sarah's breath caught as she realized the timeline aligned perfectly with her own desperate situation. The job loss, the eviction notice, the impossible decision to buy the farm with her last dollars. "Henry had been monitoring your circumstances for several years," Mr. Thompson continued, producing a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. "He was quite concerned about your employment situation at Murphy's Diner and had been preparing to intervene on your behalf when his health took a sudden turn for the worse. However, he had anticipated various scenarios and left detailed contingency plans for each possibility." The lawyer's expression softened as he studied Sarah's face, recognizing the mixture of confusion and growing comprehension in her eyes. "The sale of this property to you was not a coincidence, Mrs. Martinez. The real estate listing, the impossibly low price, the timing of it appearing just when you needed it most, All of this was orchestrated by Mr. Blackwood through legal arrangements I helped him establish months before his passing. He wanted to ensure that if something happened to him before he could help you directly, you would still receive the assistance he felt you deserved. Thompson placed the sealed envelope on the coffee table between them, its weight seeming to promise revelations that would dwarf even the extraordinary discoveries Sarah had already made. Mrs. Martinez, what you purchased for $300 was not simply a rundown farm, he said quietly, his words carrying the gravity of a man about to change someone's life forever. What you purchased was your family's future, carefully planned and legally secured by a man who believed that kindness should extend beyond the grave. Mr. Thompson's hands were steady as he broke the red wax seal and withdrew documents that would transform Sarah's understanding of everything that had happened, his voice taking on the formal cadence of legal proceedings as he began to read from Henry Blackwood's last will and testament. To Sarah Martinez, a woman of extraordinary character who has faced adversity with dignity and raised her children with love despite circumstances that would have broken lesser souls, I leave the entirety of my earthly possessions, with the understanding that she will continue the work I have begun. Sarah's vision blurred as the words washed over her, each phrase more impossible than the last. As Mr. Thompson explained that the $300 she had paid for the farm was merely a legal formality to establish ownership, that Henry had structured the transaction to preserve her dignity while ensuring she received what he considered her rightful inheritance. The estate consists of Riverside Farm and its 150 acres, 4 investment accounts totaling approximately $5.3 million, a trust fund established for your children's education worth an additional $1.2 million, and what Mr. Blackwood called his mission portfolio, containing detailed plans for continuing his philanthropic work throughout the region. The lawyer paused to let the magnitude settle in before continuing with the most extraordinary revelation of all. Mr. Blackwood spent the final 2 years of his life researching your background, Mrs. Martinez, not out of any improper interest, but because he recognized in you the same qualities that had driven his own charitable work: compassion for others, despite personal struggle, integrity in the face of hardship, and an unwavering commitment to your children's welfare above your own comfort. Emma and Jake had stopped playing and were listening with the solemn attention that children reserve for moments they sense will change everything. As Mr. Thompson explained that Henry had watched Sarah work double shifts while pregnant, had seen her sacrifice her own meals to ensure her children ate well, had witnessed her kindness to elderly customers at the diner, even when she was exhausted and struggling. He called you his successor in a letter he left for me to read after his death, Mr. Thompson said, producing another document written in Henry's careful script. He wrote that he had spent decades learning how to give effectively, how to help people without destroying their dignity, how to change lives while remaining invisible, and he believed that you possessed the natural wisdom and generous spirit necessary to continue his work. The lawyer's expression grew almost reverent as he delivered Henry's final message. The money comes with only one condition, Mrs. Martinez: that you use it not just to secure your own family's future, but to help others as he helped you, to be the anonymous angel that struggling families never know they need until help arrives unexpectedly. Sarah stared at the documents spread across her coffee table, the legal papers that represented not just financial security beyond her wildest dreams, but a calling she had never imagined, a purpose that transformed Henry Blackwood's death into her family's rebirth and her community's continued salvation. The enormity of Henry's gift crashed over Sarah like a tidal wave, and she found herself doubled over in the threadbare armchair, sobs racking her body as the full weight of his generosity and the magnitude of her new responsibility threatened to crush her beneath their combined force. $5 million was an incomprehensible sum to a woman who had counted her last pennies 3 times before buying a loaf of bread, and the idea that someone she had never met could trust her with not just his fortune but his life's mission felt impossible, overwhelming, too much for someone who had spent years simply trying to survive each day. "I can't," she gasped between sobs, her words barely audible as Mr. Thompson sat quietly, his experienced eyes understanding the shock that accompanied such life-altering revelations. "I don't know how to manage this kind of money. I don't know how to help people the way he did. I'm just a waitress who lost her job. I'm nobody special. I can't be what he thought I was." The feelings of unworthiness that had plagued her entire adult life rose up with vengeance, whispering that she was too small, too uneducated, too broken by circumstance to be worthy of such trust, and the fear of failing Henry's memory paralyzed her with its intensity. Through her tears, she became aware of small hands on her shoulders, and she looked up to find Emma and Jake flanking her chair, their young faces serious with concern and determination that belied their years. "Mama, you helped Mrs. Patterson when she couldn't carry her groceries," Emma said softly, her 8-year-old voice carrying a wisdom that stopped Sarah's spiraling thoughts. "And you gave our last sandwich to that man outside the store when he said he was hungry, even though we didn't have dinner that night." Jake nodded solemnly, his 6-year-old logic cutting through adult complexity with startling clarity. "You're already nice to people, Mama. You just never had enough money to be really nice before." Their simple words pierced through Sarah's panic, and she pulled both children into her lap, drawing strength from their unwavering faith in her goodness, their complete lack of doubt about her ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. "Mr. Henry must have seen what we see," Emma continued, stroking her mother's hair with the gentle touch of a child trying to comfort an adult. "He saw that you have a good heart, and good hearts know what to do with good things." Thompson watched this tender scene with the satisfaction of a man who had witnessed Henry's final judgment proven correct. And when Sarah looked up at him through her tears, he smiled with genuine warmth. "Mr. Blackwood told me that if you ever doubted your worthiness for this inheritance, I should remind you that worthiness isn't measured by what you've accomplished, but by what you do when you have the power to help others," he said gently. He believed that someone who would spend her last dollars to give her children a home would know exactly how to use his wealth to give other families hope. After Mr. Thompson departed with promises to help Sarah navigate the legal complexities of her inheritance, she returned to Henry's basement sanctuary with a deeper sense of purpose, drawn to the leather-bound journals she had discovered earlier. And as she opened the first volume dated 25 years ago, Henry Blackwood's private pain unfolded before her in his careful handwriting. The early entries revealed a man utterly transformed by tragedy, describing in heartbreaking detail the December morning when a drunk driver had claimed the lives of his wife Catherine and their twin daughters, 8-year-old Sophie and Sarah, in a collision that had left Henry physically unharmed but emotionally shattered beyond repair. "I survived when they did not," he had written in those first agonizing weeks after the funeral. "The randomness of it haunts me more than the grief itself. 3 lives extinguished in an instant while I walked away without a scratch, inheriting not just my family's wealth from Blackwood Industries, but a guilt that grows heavier with each passing day." Sarah's heart ached as she read about Henry's desperate attempts to find meaning in his survival, his initial descent into alcohol and despair, and his eventual realization that his family's money could become a tool for preventing other families from experiencing the kind of suffering that had consumed his world. The journals chronicled his gradual transformation from a broken man seeking oblivion to a purposeful guardian angel, as he learned that anonymous giving allowed him to honor his lost family while avoiding the painful social interactions that reminded him of everything he had lost. "Today I paid the medical bills for a young mother whose premature daughter fights for life in the same hospital where I held Catherine's hand for the last time." Read one entry from 15 years ago. "I will never meet this woman. Will never know her name or see her face. But somewhere in this act of kindness, I feel Catherine and the girls approving, guiding me toward a purpose I never expected to find." Page after page revealed Henry's meticulous research into effective philanthropy, his careful study of families in need, his development of systems to ensure his help reached deserving recipients without creating dependency or destroying dignity. He had become a student of human nature and social work, learning to identify the difference between those who needed a helping hand and those who might misuse his generosity, always striving to honor his family's memory through acts of compassion that reflected the values they had shared. The final entries, written in the months before his death, spoke of his growing concern about what would happen to his mission when he was gone, his careful observation of Sarah and her children, and his growing certainty that he had found not just a worthy recipient for his wealth, but a kindred spirit who understood that true generosity flows from personal experience with suffering. Sarah Martinez reminds me of Catherine, he had written in his last entry. Not in appearance, but in spirit. The way she protects her children, the quiet dignity with which she faces hardship, the kindness she shows others, despite her own struggles. I believe she will understand that this inheritance is not about money, but about love extending beyond the grave. 2 weeks after discovering her inheritance, Sarah sat at Henry's desk in the basement, studying the files he had kept on local families, when she came across a folder that made her pause with recognition. Henderson, Margaret and Robert, current medical crisis. Inside, she found newspaper clippings about Robert Henderson's recent diagnosis of kidney disease, correspondence from the regional medical center about the need for expensive dialysis treatments, and Henry's handwritten notes indicating that the Henderson family was facing bankruptcy due to mounting medical bills that their insurance refused to cover. The irony was not lost on Sarah that the woman who had warned her about cursed ground and buried secrets was herself in desperate need of the very help that Henry had provided to so many others. And she felt a strange mixture of compassion and poetic justice as she reached for Henry's old contact list of lawyers and medical billing administrators. The process was surprisingly straightforward once she understood Henry's methods, requiring nothing more than a few phone calls to Mr. Thompson's office and a carefully worded letter to the medical center's financial department, explaining that an anonymous benefactor wished to settle the Henderson account in full. Sarah found herself holding her breath as she signed the check for $37,000, an amount that would have represented a lifetime of savings just months ago, but now felt like a small portion of the vast resources Henry had entrusted to her care. 3 days later, she was hanging laundry on the line behind the farmhouse when she spotted Mrs. Ayet Henderson walking across the field that separated their properties, and Sarah's heart raced as she wondered if her neighbor had somehow discovered the source of her family's unexpected financial reprieve. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there during her earlier warnings about the farm. "I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you my gratitude." The older woman's eyes were bright with unshed tears as she explained how a miracle had occurred, how an anonymous donor had appeared like an answer to prayer to pay for Robert's medical treatments, allowing him to begin the dialysis that would save his life. "I don't know who our guardian angel is," Mrs. Henderson said, clasping Sarah's hands with surprising warmth. "But I've been thinking about what I said to you about this place, about Henry Blackwood, and I wonder if perhaps we all misjudged him terribly." Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest as she listened to her neighbor's gratitude, understanding for the first time the profound joy that Henry must have experienced in these moments of secret generosity. The satisfaction of knowing that somewhere in the world, a family was sleeping peacefully because of kindness they would never be able to thank or repay. "Maybe," Sarah said softly, looking back toward the farmhouse that had become her family's salvation. "Maybe some secrets are meant to be buried, not because they're dark, but because they're so bright they might blind us if we look directly at them." As Mrs. Henderson walked home with lighter steps than Sarah had ever seen her take, she realized that she was beginning to understand the true nature of Henry's legacy. Not just the money or the mission, but the profound transformation that occurred in both giver and receiver when love moved anonymously through the world. Spring arrived at Riverside Farm with a symphony of hammers and saws as Sarah embarked on the most meaningful construction project of her life, transforming Henry's neglected property not into a mansion of personal luxury, but into a sanctuary where families facing their darkest hours could find the same hope and fresh start that she had discovered in its rooms. Working with contractors who had been moved by her vision of creating temporary housing for those in crisis, Sarah watched as the old farmhouse slowly regained its former dignity, with a new roof to keep the rain out, fresh paint that gleamed white in the morning sun, and windows that sparkled with the promise of better days ahead. The renovation plans that spread across Henry's basement desk showed not palatial additions, but practical improvements designed with struggling families in mind. The large living room divided into two smaller apartments, each with its own kitchenette and bathroom. The upstairs bedrooms converted into family suites that could house parents and children together, and the old barn transformed into a community space where residents could share meals, children could play safely, and workshops could be held on everything from job interview skills to financial planning. Sarah found herself thinking constantly about the families who would soon call this place home temporarily. Remembering her own desperate search for shelter and security, and she insisted that every detail reflect dignity rather than charity. From the cheerful yellow paint in the children's rooms to the small gardens where each family could grow their own vegetables and flowers. The contractors marveled at her attention to details that spoke of respect for the future residents. Solid locks on every door to ensure privacy, soundproofing between units so families could maintain their independence, and a separate entrance to the basement office where Sarah planned to continue Henry's philanthropic work without intruding on the daily lives of those she was helping. Most folks with this kind of money would be building themselves a palace, observed Jim Morrison, the lead contractor, as he watched Sarah carefully inspect the installation of energy-efficient appliances that would keep utility costs low for struggling families. Instead, you're building hope for people you haven't even met yet. The truth of his words settled deep in Sarah's heart as she stood in the renovated kitchen where she had once counted her last dollars, realizing that Henry's gift had given her something far more valuable than financial security. It had given her purpose, a way to transform her own experience of desperation into a source of salvation for others. Emma and Jake moved through the construction zones with the easy adaptability of children, their excitement building as they helped Sarah plan the children's play area and suggested improvements that only kids would think of, like lower light switches and step stools in the bathrooms. "We're going to help other kids like Mr. Henry helped us," Emma declared with the matter-of-fact certainty of an 8-year-old who had already learned that kindness could change everything, and Sarah knew that her children were learning lessons about generosity and compassion that no amount of money could ever purchase. The transformation in Emma and Jake over the months following their inheritance was perhaps the most remarkable change of all, as Sarah watched her children evolve from worried little souls who had learned to whisper their needs so as not to burden their struggling mother, into confident young philanthropists who approached their new circumstances with a wisdom that often left adults speechless. Emma had taken to keeping a notebook where she recorded ideas for helping other children, her 8-year-old handwriting carefully listing suggestions like warm coats for kids who don't have them, and birthday parties for children whose families can't afford cake, while Jake had begun collecting his own toys to give to families who would stay at the renovated farm, explaining with 6-year-old logic that toys are more fun when you share them with new friends. Their insights into the practical needs of struggling families often surpassed those of the adults around them, shaped by their own recent experience of doing without, and Sarah found herself turning to them regularly for advice that cut through complicated adult reasoning to reach the heart of what truly mattered. "Mama, when kids come to stay here, they might be scared like we were our first night," Emma observed during one of their evening planning sessions in Henry's basement office, now transformed into the command center for their expanding charitable work. "Maybe we should make welcome bags with flashlights and snacks and maybe a stuffed animal, so they know someone cares about them being comfortable." Jake nodded solemnly, adding his own perspective with the earnestness that had become his trademark since learning about their mission. "And we should tell them that the house makes funny noises, but it's not scary. It's just old and trying to keep everyone safe." Their suggestions consistently demonstrated an understanding of dignity and respect that impressed even Mr. Thompson during his regular visits to help Sarah manage the legal aspects of the foundation they were establishing in Henry's name. "The children want to create a lending library where kids can borrow books, but also where they can leave books for other children," Sarah explained to the lawyer during one such meeting. Emma said that when you're sad, sometimes reading about other people's adventures helps you remember that your own story might have a happy ending too. The children had also insisted on establishing what they called the Secret Helper Fund, a portion of their inheritance dedicated specifically to small acts of kindness that children could perform for other children, like paying for school lunches, buying school supplies, or ensuring that every child in their district had warm winter clothes. "We want to be secret helpers like Mr. Henry was," Jake explained to anyone who would listen, his young face serious with purpose. But we're little, so we need to help in little ways that matter to other little people. Sarah often found herself moved to tears by their natural generosity and their intuitive understanding that true wealth lay not in what they could buy for themselves, but in what they could give to others. And she realized that Henry had not only provided her children with financial security, but had given them the gift of understanding their place in a larger story of human kindness that would shape their character for the rest of their lives. The revelation began with Mrs. Henderson's casual mention of her family's mysterious medical bill payment at the weekly church service, which prompted Sally Jenkins to gasp aloud as she remembered the anonymous scholarship that had appeared just when her daughter needed college tuition. And within hours, the small community of Riverside Valley was buzzing with stories that painted an entirely different picture of the man they had dismissed as a hermit. Dr. Patricia Morris shared how an unnamed benefactor had covered the emergency surgery costs for 3 different families over the past decade, always paying through the same law firm that people now recognized as Mr. Blank Thompson's office, while the principal of Riverside Elementary revealed that their anonymous donor, who had funded the new playground equipment, the library renovation, and countless student lunch accounts, had been Henry Blackwood all along. The grocery store owner, Frank Castellano, stood in his parking lot telling anyone who would listen about the mysterious customer who had prepaid grocery bills for struggling families, leaving detailed instructions about which items to include, and always insisting that the recipients never learn the identity of their benefactor. 23 years I've been taking those calls, Frank said, shaking his head in amazement. 23 years of people coming in to find their bills already paid, and I always wondered who had that kind of heart and that kind of money to spend on strangers. The stories multiplied throughout the week as people connected dots they had never thought to connect before. The anonymous donor who had saved the community center from closure, the mystery benefactor who had paid for new uniforms for the youth baseball team, the generous soul who had covered funeral expenses for families who couldn't afford proper burials for their loved ones. Pastor Williams found himself fielding phone calls from parishioners who suddenly understood that their prayers for financial help had been answered not by divine intervention alone, but by a man who had lived just miles away, watching their struggles with the compassion of someone who truly understood loss. The coffee shop became an impromptu gathering place where neighbors shared their stories of unexpected kindness, each tale adding another layer to the emerging portrait of Henry Blackwood as their community's guardian angel, a man whose grief had transformed into a mission of preventing others from experiencing the suffering he had endured. I called him a hermit, Tom Bradley admitted to anyone who would listen, his weathered face creased with shame. Said he was unfriendly, antisocial, maybe even dangerous. Truth is, he was probably the most social man in town, just doing it all in secret, touching every life without anyone knowing. The collective guilt was palpable, as people realized they had not only misjudged Henry, but had failed to see the profound loneliness of a man who had dedicated his life to caring for them, while believing he had to remain invisible to do so effectively. Sarah watched this community-wide awakening with a mixture of sadness for Henry, who had never experienced the gratitude he deserved, and determination to ensure that his memory would finally receive the honor and recognition that had eluded him in life. The learning curve of managing $5 million proved steeper than Sarah had ever imagined, and her first months as a philanthropist were marked by mistakes that taught her painful lessons about the difference between helping and enabling, between generosity and wisdom. Her initial impulse had been to say yes to every request that crossed her desk, resulting in several $1,000s given to families who used the money for luxury purchases rather than necessities, and one particularly devastating case where her generous donation to a struggling father had funded a gambling addiction rather than the children's needs she had intended to support. Henry's detailed notebooks became her salvation during these difficult early days, as she discovered his careful observations about the psychology of giving and receiving, his hard-learned rules about conducting background research, and his insistence on providing assistance that empowered rather than created dependency. True charity, Henry had written in one particularly insightful passage, requires the wisdom to know when to give, when to withhold, and when to give something other than money, such as opportunity, education, or simply someone who believes in their potential. Sarah struggled particularly with the balance between her mission and her children's needs, finding herself torn between Emma's request for a bicycle and her knowledge that the same money could feed a family for a month, until Jake's innocent observation that we can't help other people if we're not happy too, reminded her that caring for her own children was part of her responsibility, not separate from it. The administrative challenges were overwhelming at first, as she learned to navigate tax laws, legal requirements for charitable giving, and the complex process of verifying need without compromising dignity. But Mr. Thompson's patient guidance and Henry's meticulous record-keeping system gradually transformed her from an overwhelmed novice into a thoughtful steward of her inherited mission. She made the mistake of giving too much too quickly to one family, inadvertently creating resentment among their neighbors who wondered why they hadn't been chosen for similar help, and learned from Henry's notes that effective giving often required careful consideration of community dynamics and potential unintended consequences. The emotional toll was perhaps the most difficult aspect, as Sarah found herself carrying the weight of knowing about every financial crisis, every medical emergency, every family facing eviction or hunger in her community. And she began to understand why Henry had chosen solitude as a necessary protection against the overwhelming nature of human suffering. "I thought having money would make helping people easy," she confided to Emma one evening as they reviewed funding requests together. "But it turns out that knowing how to help wisely is much harder than just wanting to help." Emma's response, she delivered with the straightforward wisdom of a 9-year-old, became Sarah's guiding principle. "Maybe that's why Mr. Henry picked you, Mama. Because you care enough to worry about doing it right, even when it's hard." Gradually, Sarah developed her own system of checks and balances, combining Henry's methodical approach with her natural empathy, learning to investigate before giving, to follow up after assistance was provided, and to trust her instincts about when generosity might do more harm than good. The knock on the farmhouse door came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in late October, and Sarah opened it to find a scene that transported her instantly back to her own darkest moments. A young man in his 30s stood on her porch with 2 small children clinging to his sides, all 3 of them soaked to the bone and carrying everything they owned in 2 battered suitcases and a handful of plastic grocery bags. David Chen introduced himself with the quiet desperation of a man who had exhausted every other option, explaining that his wife Maria had died in a car accident 6 months earlier, leaving him to care for 4-year-old Lily and 7-year-old Marcus while struggling with medical debt, funeral expenses, and his own grief that made it impossible to maintain steady employment. Sarah's heart recognized the hollow look in his eyes, the same expression she had worn during those final weeks in their old apartment when hope had seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford, and she immediately invited the family inside where Emma and Jake hung back shyly, but offered the newcomers towels and hot cocoa with the generous instincts their mother had cultivated in them. "We heard about your place from someone at the community center," David explained, his voice breaking slightly as Lily curled up in his lap, exhausted from what had clearly been a long and difficult journey. "They said you might have room for families who needed a fresh start, and I didn't know where else to turn." The apartment Sarah led them to had been completed just weeks earlier, painted in warm colors that Emma had chosen specifically to welcome frightened children, furnished with comfortable but practical pieces that could withstand the chaos of family life, and stocked with basic necessities so that new arrivals could focus on healing rather than logistics. As she showed David the small kitchen where he could prepare meals for his children, the cozy living room where they could build the kind of family traditions that trauma had interrupted, and the bedrooms where Lily and Marcus could sleep peacefully for the first time in months, Sarah saw her own journey reflected in their faces. The disbelief that such kindness existed, the fear that it might be too good to be true, and the tentative hope that maybe their story wasn't over after all. "How much is the rent?" David asked quietly, and Sarah smiled as she delivered the same impossible news that Henry had given her through Mr. Thompson's careful orchestration. "There is no rent," she said gently. "This is a place for families to catch their breath, to heal, and to plan their next steps without the pressure of impossible bills or the fear of homelessness hanging over their heads." That night, as Sarah tucked Emma and Jake into their own beds and listened to the sounds of another family settling into safety just across the courtyard, she understood with perfect clarity why Henry had found such profound meaning in anonymous giving, and why he had trusted her to continue the sacred work of transforming desperation into hope, one family at a time. The memorial garden took shape in the meadow behind the farmhouse, where Henry had once tended his own private sanctuary, and Sarah worked alongside volunteers from throughout the community to create a space that would honor the man whose true nature had remained hidden for far too long. The centerpiece was a simple granite bench engraved with Henry's favorite quote from his journals: "True generosity plants seeds in gardens we may never see, surrounded by flowering trees that would bloom each spring in remembrance of lives he had touched, and pathways lined with stones donated by families who wanted to contribute something permanent to honor their anonymous benefactor." The dedication ceremony drew nearly 200 people on a crisp Sunday afternoon in November, filling the garden with voices that had never spoken Henry's name in gratitude while he lived, but now rose in unified testimony to the extraordinary legacy he had left behind. Sarah stood before the gathered crowd with a mixture of nervousness and profound purpose, knowing that this moment would transform Henry's memory from the whispered warnings of suspicious neighbors into the celebrated story of a man whose love had transcended his own pain to embrace an entire community. One by one, people stepped forward to share their stories. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow whose heating bills had been mysteriously paid each winter for 15 years. The Jacobson family, whose son's cancer treatments had been covered by an anonymous donor who somehow knew exactly when their insurance had reached its limits. Maria Santos, whose premature daughter had received the same life-saving intervention that had rescued Emma 8 years earlier. Pastor Williams spoke of the countless funeral expenses that had been quietly covered, allowing families to grieve with dignity rather than debt, while Dr. Morris shared her amazement at discovering that nearly 40% of her pro bono cases over the past 2 decades had been secretly funded by the same mysterious benefactor. The high school principal revealed that 63 students had received anonymous scholarships that had changed the trajectory of their lives, and the owner of the hardware store explained how an unnamed customer had prepaid for building supplies that had helped rebuild homes after the tornado 3 years ago. "Henry Blackwood was not the hermit we thought he was," declared Tom Bradley, his voice carrying the weight of community-wide regret and recognition. "He was the most connected man among us, touching every life, knowing every need, caring for every family while asking for nothing in return, except the privacy to do good without recognition." Children who had benefited from Henry's generosity placed flowers on the memorial, while their parents wiped away tears and shared quiet words of gratitude for a man whose name they were finally learning to speak with reverence rather than suspicion. Sarah concluded the ceremony by reading Henry's own words from his final journal entry. "I have learned that love multiplies when it moves in secret, that kindness grows stronger when it expects no recognition, and that the greatest memorial to a life lived in service is not a monument to the giver, but the continuation of giving itself." As the sun set over the memorial garden, casting long shadows across the peaceful gathering, Sarah realized that Henry's transformation from misunderstood recluse to beloved guardian angel was complete, and that his true monument would not be granite and flowers, but the ongoing work of compassion that would ripple through generations yet to come. 1 year to the day after Sarah had first stepped through the gates of Riverside Farm with her last $300 and 2 frightened children, the property buzzed with the joyful chaos of the first annual Henry Blackwood Day of Giving, transforming the once lonely farm into a celebration that would have brought tears to the eyes of the man whose memory it honored. Families arrived throughout the morning, some carrying covered dishes and others bringing handmade gifts for the silent auction, but all united by the invisible thread of Henry's kindness that had woven their stories together across years and circumstances they had never known they shared. Sarah moved through the crowd with Emma and Jake at her side, marveling at the transformation not just of the property, but of the entire community's understanding of what it meant to care for one another, as she watched children who had been strangers just hours before playing together on the playground that Henry's foundation had built, while their parents shared stories of survival and hope around picnic tables positioned throughout the memorial garden. The Chen family, now thriving in their permanent home that Sarah had helped them secure, worked alongside the Henderson family to serve lunch, while Dr. Morris and her husband manned the booth where people could sign up to volunteer for various charitable projects that the Henry Blackwood Foundation would fund throughout the coming year. Former scholarship recipients, now college graduates and young professionals, returned to share their success stories with current students who were benefiting from the same anonymous generosity that had changed their lives, creating a beautiful circle of gratitude and inspiration that rippled across generations. "Look at this, Mama," Emma said, tugging on Sarah's sleeve as she pointed toward the memorial bench, where a group of elderly residents sat sharing memories of unexpected kindnesses they had received over the years, their voices carrying the reverent tones of people speaking about a saint they had been privileged to know, even if they had never realized it at the time. The afternoon featured presentations about the Foundation's work over the past year. 12 families had been housed temporarily at the farm. 47 medical bills had been paid anonymously. 33 students had received scholarships, and countless small acts of kindness had been performed in Henry's name throughout the region. Sarah stood before the assembled crowd as the sun began to set, feeling the weight and wonder of her transformed life as she looked out at faces that represented not just the recipients of Henry's generosity, but the living legacy of a man who had turned his greatest pain into the world's gain. Henry Blackwood taught us that love doesn't end with death, that generosity can be inherited like any other treasure, and that the most powerful way to honor those we've lost is to continue the work of caring for those who remain, she said, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering. Today we celebrate not just his memory, but our commitment to ensuring that his mission of anonymous kindness will continue through each of us, in ways both large and small, for as long as there are families who need to know that someone cares. As the evening stars began to appear above Riverside Farm, Sarah realized with perfect clarity that she had found not just financial security or even a home, but her life's true calling, and that Henry's greatest gift had not been his money, but his example of how one person's compassion could create ripples of hope that would continue expanding long after their own story had ended. 2 years have passed since Sarah Martinez counted her last $300 in desperation, and as she stands in the thriving memorial garden where dozens of families gather each month for community dinners and support meetings, she marvels at how completely her life has been transformed by a man she never met, but whose love continues to guide every decision she makes. The Riverside Farm has become more than a temporary shelter for struggling families. It has evolved into a beacon of hope that draws social workers, philanthropists, and community leaders from across the state who come to study how effective giving can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Sarah has welcomed 43 families through the farm's doors, watched children heal from trauma in the safety of its walls, and helped parents rebuild their confidence and financial stability before moving on to permanent housing. But perhaps more importantly, she has learned that Henry's true gift was not his money, but his understanding that generosity multiplies when it flows from one grateful heart to another. The foundation now employs 6 full-time staff members, including Emma and Jake, who have grown into young advocates for children in crisis, and has established partnerships with schools, hospitals, and social service agencies that extend Henry's mission far beyond what he could have accomplished alone, creating a network of anonymous kindness that touches hundreds of lives each year without fanfare or recognition. As Sarah watches the sun set over the property where her journey began, she reflects on the profound truth that Henry understood from his own experience with loss, that our darkest moments often prepare us to become sources of light for others, that the pain we survive can become the foundation for compassion we share, and that sometimes the greatest blessings in our lives come disguised as our most desperate circumstances. She thinks about the families who will sleep peacefully tonight because someone they will never meet chose to care, about the children whose dreams will survive because an anonymous benefactor believed in their potential, and about the ripple effect of kindness that extends far beyond what any single act of generosity can measure or contain. Looking directly at you, dear viewer, Sarah wants you to understand that Henry Blackwood's story is not unique in its capacity for transformation, but rather in its reminder that each of us possesses the power to change lives in ways we may never fully comprehend, that kindness creates ripples we may never see, but that continue expanding long after we have forgotten the stones we threw into the waters of human need. The man her neighbors called a hermit became her family's salvation, not through magic or coincidence, but through the deliberate choice to transform his own suffering into a source of healing for others, and his legacy lives on in every family that finds hope when hope seemed impossible, in every child who learns that strangers can become guardian angels, and in every person who realizes that their own story of struggle might be preparation for becoming someone else's miracle. Remember that your own acts of kindness, no matter how small they may seem, plant seeds in gardens you may never see, but that will bloom in ways that honor both the giver and the receiver, creating a world where love truly does multiply when it moves in secret, and where the greatest memorials to lives well lived are not monuments of stone, but the continuing legacy of compassion that flows from one grateful heart to another, generation after generation, forever and always.